Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, I've got a favorite headline, if not of the week or month, perhaps of the year. It's from my old friend Gary Marcus. He put something on his Marcus on AI Substack saying things are so desperate at OpenAI that Sam Altman is starting to sound like Gary Marcus. And there's a photo of the two men, Sam and Gary, in the snow, smiling at one another. And I'm thrilled. We don't have Sam Altman. He wasn't available, so I had to get Gary Marcus. Gary Marcus, the great Gary Marcus. Marcus on AI is also the author of Taming Silicon Valley. I think it was a best-selling book last year. Gary, how does it feel to be like Sam Altman? You're beginning to look alike too.
Well, that picture, I should advise you, is fake. And it's not that I'm becoming like him, but that he's becoming like me. Those are two totally different things. If I were becoming like him, I guess I would be a multi-billionaire doing lots of crazy deals. But he's becoming like me because he's starting to warn of an AI bubble, which is something that I've warned about on your show many times. And he's like me because he's trying to downscale expectations. Of course, before he was making insane expectations that GPT-5 would be like AGI. And I was here on your show and elsewhere saying that's not really going to happen. And it didn't really happen. So he's kind of retrenching, which makes him saying all kinds of crazy things, like things that I've said before.
So I got the wrong guy. I should have got Sam Altman, but as I said, he wasn't available. If we had Sam on the show, Gary, what would he be saying in response to your headline that the two of you are beginning to think alike? He's a slippery character and he changes from day to day. Would he acknowledge perhaps that some of your concerns and critiques have actually been right?
Of course he would not. He called me a troll and a mediocre deep learning skeptic, basically because I said scaling wasn't going to work. And scaling didn't really work. I mean, it's taken us a certain amount, but there's been diminishing returns. Do you think Sam would come on your show and say, well, Gary Marcus told us so? Of course he wouldn't.
I bet you if he came on, he would deny even knowing you. He would say, Sam, he would say, Gary who?
That's right. Even though we sat next to each other for 3 hours in front of millions of cameras at the U.S. Senate, he's not always bound by facts. Let's be honest.
Is that a polite way of saying that he doesn't tell the truth?
Not always, certainly. I mean, for example, at the U.S. Senate, he said that he got no equity from OpenAI, but he actually had indirect equity from OpenAI through Y Combinator. He said at the Senate that he supported artists' rights, that they should get some money for copyright. Now he's trying to evade that. He said he supported regulation, and now he's trying to evade that too.
I'm guessing, Gary, your favorite headline of the last few weeks is one on Fortune that says, it's almost tragic. Bubble or not, the AI backlash is validating what one researcher and critic has been saying for years. Did you pay for that headline?
I did not. I did not pay for it, but I guess I get these emails every day of people asking for $1,500 for magazine coverage. I guess that one would have been $1,500 well spent, but no, I didn't. I did answer the guy's questions when he interviewed.
So how does it feel, Gary, to be proved right? I'm not in the Gary Marcus class, but I have to admit, 20 years ago, I was predicting that Web 2.0 wouldn't work out, and everyone criticized me, and 20 years later, everyone's telling me they were right. I was right, not them. How does it feel to be proved right?
I mean, I always knew that I would be. I understood how these things work. I first started doing experiments on neural networks in 1998, or really 1997, published them in 1998. I've always seen the limitations. I always knew that this moment would come. that made it more bearable when people sent an unbelievable amount of shit my way. I knew that I'd be vindicated. I didn't know if I'd be vindicated this year, next year, the year after. I didn't know when, but I knew that there were limits to how these models work, and that, as Shakespeare said, the truth will out, and it did.
Was that real Shakespeare or Shakespeare on AI?
I believe that was real Shakespeare, although, my memory is no longer perfect.
So what's happening, Gary? You've been skeptical for a while. You're not alone, although you've been perhaps the most vocal and entertaining of critics. Is it this GPT-5 thing that suddenly broke the dam?
Yeah, I think more than anything else. So, on the one hand, I was very specific in predicting that GPT-5 would be late, that it probably wouldn't be as impressive as people thought. So, relative to other critics, I was more vocal about that. I was more specific about that. I was earlier about that. I was specific about what the limitations were. And yeah, the fact that GPT-5 was underwhelming, I think, really did change the narrative here. The other piece of it is that the aforementioned Sam kept hyping it. He kept implying that OpenAI knew how to make AGI. He said in a January blog, for example, that we're now confident we know how to build AI in the conventional sense. And so, he's been on tour for a couple of years telling anybody who wants to hear him that AGI is close, saying that one way or another, sometimes more directly, sometimes less. So the expectations, I think it's fair to say, for GPT-5 were higher than for any product release, maybe ever. Maybe there's like 2 or 3 products.
Well,
ever
the iPhone,
I
think, was a big deal too, wasn't it?
Maybe the iPhone, although, we look back on the iPhone and we see it in one way. But when it first came out, there were other phones around. Like, some people were excited about it, some people weren't. But yeah, maybe the hype matched the iPhone. You could argue about that. But, let's say it's in the top 5 most hyped products of all time, and then it just didn't deliver. It wasn't that different from GPT 4.1. It wasn't that different from Grok 4, et cetera, et cetera. It was supposed to be this like quantum leap forward. Instead, it was an incremental change. It was fine. If they had called it GPT 4.6, I don't think they would have gotten the same backlash. But the other thing is they'd been working on it for 34 months. And I think if they had called it GPT 4.6, then people might have said, well, they just don't know how to deliver anymore. They can't actually make GPT-5. So they were a little bit of between a rock and a hard place, given that they didn't really know how to make something that matched the hype that they had put around it.
I'm sure you talk to a lot of people inside OpenAI unofficially. Is there a lot of pressure there for what's your take on the importance of GPT-5 within OpenAI? Was Sam himself the creator of the myth, or perhaps the lie of GPT-5, or was it coming from investors or technologists? What's the story from inside?
I don't have that much inside information.
Well, what's your sense?
My sense is that Sam hyped this because he needs money badly. One thing that's not immediately apparent to the outside is that he has a cash flow problem. You might think, well, they've raised money on a $300 billion valuation. They must be as rich as sin. There must be you walk the halls and there must be, stashes of $1 billion here and $1 billion there. But building what they've built because of the approach that they've taken, which is to use as much data and compute as possible, is really expensive. And then never mind all of the, money that they're paying employees, and, however many millions of dollars a piece and so forth. So they're actually really desperate for money. And they probably have, I don't know, a year's runway, something like that, 6 months, 18 months, but they don't have 5 years runway. So they just don't have that much money. And so they're constantly in a race to raise more money. Sam has to raise money constantly. And the way these things work, you always have to raise at a higher valuation. It's considered a tragedy if you raise at a lower valuation. And there are some tricks that he can play, like giving away certain rights to new investors so that they'll tolerate higher valuations and things like that. But the bottom line is he needs to hype. He really does, in order to raise the money so that it doesn't go out of business.
Right. And I think this is perhaps the most important story in economic terms, and in terms of Silicon Valley. lots of pieces now about why AI stocks are giving some investors dot-com bubble deja vu. But this is different from the 90s because it's all being driven by a handful of companies, mostly OpenAI. So this is new. This didn't happen in the 90s, did it?
I'm not an expert on all of the things that happened in the 90s. I mean, my expertise is really about AI and not the economics of valuation and so forth. I know something about that. I know something about that situation. I know something about this situation. I don't think things are identical. What I can really tell you about is where we are right now is we have valuations that don't really make sense in terms of the economics. So think about OpenAI. They're valued at $300 billion. They're trying to raise more money at a $500 billion valuation. They made $1 billion last month, which was their record, which puts them on pace to make $12 billion. But they probably spent double that. So they're losing, let's say, $1 billion a month. And they never turned a profit. It's a big lift to say that a company that has never turned a profit is worth a third of or half of $1 trillion. It's just not obvious that that's true. And valuations are hard to understand, and there's lots of details that get swept under the rug and so forth. But it's a claim that's a stretch, let's say. I'm on record as saying OpenAI could turn out to be the WeWork of AI. WeWork didn't go out of business after its peak, but it went down a bunch.
And I think one thing you don't tend to do, Gary, is underestimate, but actually I think that's underestimating the potential problem here. There's not the WeWork. I mean, WeWork didn't affect the broader economy. It wasn't that big a deal. It was just another scam or certainly an example of ridiculously exuberant enthusiasm, irrational exuberance, as one economist called it. But this could conceivably, it's not going to bring some people are already talking about it bringing the entire stock market into free fall. That won't happen, probably because OpenAI isn't a public company. But it has enormous significance. You're laying it out very clearly, and I think you're onto something of great importance. They raise more and more money. It costs more and more for the compute to produce this product. So yes, many people are using it, but they can't make money out of it. And so in the long run, is this even a viable company?
I mean, it's not clear. I mean, there's two sides to this. So one is the question you're asking that I'll call the contagion effect. So let's say a company like OpenAI or Anthropic suddenly ceases to be valued at the kinds of rates that it is, and other people get wind of that. So there's the contagion effect. And then, let's just stick with the contagion effect. So the question is, what is the chance that if one of these companies goes down, they take down, as that article suggested, the whole market with it? I don't know the answer to that. A lot of it has to do with crowd psychology. I would say that crowd psychology drove this market up because people imagined revenue there that they couldn't. Let me come back to surveillance in a second. So you have that side of it. Then you have the fact that NVIDIA's value is based on how many chips people think they're going to sell. If you had even one of their big 5 customers go down, that's going to totally change the market. I mean, imagine that OpenAI has to sell some of its chips, or imagine that they're just stopped buying chips, or through Microsoft or however that's working. They suddenly become less interested in chips. Well, that affects NVIDIA, and NVIDIA is a very large part of the exchange it's listed on, and so a whole bunch of things.
Yeah, it's currently, I think as we speak, it's about a $5 trillion company. So,
I mean, that doesn't really seem to make sense. My view is that NVIDIA is a very well-run company. I've talked to Jensen Huang. I think he's smart. I've talked to a lot of his staff. He has great people. It's a very well-run company. I've heard, that OpenAI is not nearly so well-run. But NVIDIA is genuinely well-run, has been well-run for a long time. It's a very solid company. The products that it make are really good. They do essentially what they're promised, with some asterisks, but basically they do what they're promised. The problem is whether the customers really want to buy as many of them as they currently are. And that depends on all these other companies. So NVIDIA is dependent on Google, Facebook, OpenAI, Anthropic, etc., having an insatiable desire for chips. But that insatiable desire for chips is mostly, I think, based on the fantasy that if we have more chips, or I left out Grok or XAI, if we have more chips, then we're going to get to AGI. And I think what we have seen from the disappointments of GPT-5, Grok 4, Llama 4, etc., is that this is not actually going to get us to AGI. And if one of these companies has a change of heart, that could bring down a large part of the stock market. It could gut a lot of pension funds and so forth. So it could. I don't know for sure. I mean, there's lots of other things in the economy. Maybe it's just some big investors and some pension funds take a hit and other people are fine. I don't know. We will find out, I think. I do think that there will be some kind of major correction here. How far it extends, I don't know. But the other thing I wanted to say is OpenAI is pushed into needing to become, I think, a surveillance company. So the thing that they have in spades is data from people typing in really personal stuff. And lots of people use these things as therapists, they put company data, etc. That's valuable. So even if they can't build AGI, or especially if they can't build AGI, they can start to think about how to monetize that data. I think that's their next move. I think that's why they're building some kind of thing with Johnny Ive, some kind of hardware device. I think their game is to surveil everything you say and do. And like Facebook, to turn the user into the product.
Yeah, and then it wouldn't be the first time that's happened. The story of Google is like that, of course. The Sergey and Larry built the engine against the business model of advertising, and then they were forced into using advertising because they didn't have any choice. And you're suggesting that perhaps OpenAI will have the same unpleasant, uncomfortable conclusions. I think you may be right, although it will keep a lot of lawyers very busy. There are other implications, Gary, too. There was a big piece in the Times a couple of weeks ago about how this massive demand for compute, what they call big tech's AI data centers, are driving up the electricity bills for everyone. Google just invested in nuclear power. This is changing the very nature of the power business because of our friend, your friend and my friend, Sam Altman.
Well, and Elon Musk, and I mean, it's
right,
not
and
just
the whole gang, Elon and Sam,
the whole
and
gang.
else.
Yes, they are almost certainly driving up electricity prices. I don't even know if that's in my top 5 worst things that they're doing. I would say that they're also creating tools that get used for misinformation that undermine democracy. Facebook did that, and they're doing it in a worse way. They are, creating tools that get used to make non-consensual deepfake porn. They're making tools that are being used for cyber attacks in unprecedented numbers, etc. There's the emissions related to the electricity. There's the water use. There's a long list of negative consequences. There are these people now who are experiencing delusions because the AI systems are sycophantic and not very well grounded in truth, and they can't, correct people when they're doing dangerous things, or can't always do so, etc. So there's a long list of negative consequences. The companies want us to bear all of them the way that steel companies used to dump everything in the water, and it was tough luck for the rest of us, and that's kind of been the attitude. So it is tough luck for the rest of us that electricity prices are very likely to go up or are.
Well, but I think it's more than tough luck. I think when a lot of people just don't understand how all this stuff's linked, and they won't yet until something dramatic happens. But once it happens, then it will become obvious. It was like with Enron, or perhaps even the great crash of the late 20s.
I mean, that's certainly a possible scenario. I wouldn't bet everything.
I wouldn't say the great crash, but I'm not suggesting that history repeats itself. But what is certainly happening is there are consequences of these tens of billions of dollars that are flowing into businesses that, as you say, are not only currently unprofitable, but may never be profitable.
I mean, there will be consequences. We have to see what those consequences are. I'll say that I've been thinking lately about my own track record for predictions. And on the technical side, I think that I have a stellar record, probably unequaled, in terms of where are these models going to break down? What won't they be able to do? I've been just right over and over and over again. You can read my essay, 25 predictions for 2025, to get some sense of that. Where I have been less accurate is on predicting the market and valuations and so forth. Right? One is a technical thing about the nature of what cognition is and the nature of how these models work, etc. And I've been really quite good on those things. But I thought OpenAI would have gone down by now, and it's very hard to predict exactly when a market will react to a certain piece of information and how. I'm sure you know the famous saying about whether you should short a stock as a retail investor. And the line is that the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. It's just very hard to predict crowd psychology. Or take another example, there's nothing to do with me or AI, is I'm sure some people living when the tulips prices in Holland went up and up, some people probably said this can't last, but who could name when it would last? When it would come to an end. And so, it's one thing to say, I think this is all going to fall apart. It's another thing to say, I know the timeline and how it's going to spread as a contagion and so forth. I think that's a harder call that's not about the technical stuff so far. It's not even about the fundamentals and the economics of the stocks. It's really about attitude. But having said all that, the attitude has really changed in the last few weeks because of GPT-5 being disappointing. So you have people like David Sachs, who is a friend of Elon Musk's, a Silicon Valley investor on the show All In, but also now the White House advisor on AI. And a few months ago, he's like, scaling is going to get us 1,000x AI. And yesterday or a couple of days ago or something like that, he said, yeah, I think scaling has kind of run its course. That's not a verbatim quote, but it's roughly what he said. That's significant that somebody like that is losing faith in scaling. In fact, a lot of people are. There are a few people here or there who's still saying it's all exponential. I see progress, or whatever. But most people, I think, are now seeing it. And you have lots of essays like the ones I was writing a couple of years ago, but a lot of essays now saying, there's a bubble and so forth, as our conversation is now. And so the attitude has changed from almost unshakable faith that we were going to get to AGI in 2027, which I always said was absurd, to a lot of people waking up and realizing, okay, we need to figure out what we can do with these tools, but we're not getting to AGI soon. More scaling is not doing that well for us.
Yeah, and AGI, I couldn't agree more. It will seem absurd, and I'm not sure why anyone encouraged Sam to use the term, or anyone else. Where are we then in the narrative, Gary? You said you've been pretty accurate on the tech side.
So on the tech narrative?
Well, let me ask you, whether it's GPT-5 or the Anthropic engine or Grok, they all seem to be relatively similar. How much better can they become?
I don't think that what we call the base language models are going to get that much better. So all of the excitement about scaling was we can make these base models using as much data and compute as possible, and they'll just keep getting better. And what I said a few years ago is that's going to have its limit, and it's not going to solve certain problems like hallucinations and stupid errors and so forth, and it hasn't. And there has been a kind of diminishing returns. Where there have been advances is actually in neurosymbolic AI, which is something that I've been pushing for 30 years. The advances have really come from sticking symbolic tools, classic computer code like Python, as opposed to neural networks, into these systems. That's actually been where the lift, as we call it, in the last couple of years has come from. I still don't think people are doing it right, but they're getting some leverage out of that. Ultimately, I think we need a new paradigm altogether. And when we get to that new paradigm, depends on when people recognize that the current paradigm is not really working. As long as people are kind of doggedly committed to just adding more data and compute and not doing any other kind of work, we have a problem. Investors have basically shut out anything that isn't an LLM for almost 5 years, which I think is really tragic. Maybe people will wake up and start to consider other things. That's when we'll get an advance.
You've always been very suspicious of LLMs. You've been on the show several times arguing this, and as you suggest, particularly times when it wasn't very unfashionable. In a metaphorical sense, is generative AI, these LLMs, are they cul-de-sacs? Or can they lead to better models, better new technologies that can do some of the stuff that LLMs don't seem to be able to? Do we have to, in other words, do we have to go in one end of the cul-de-sac with LLMs, generative AI, then realize there's no exit and come out back where we started and then start again? Or we're in a stronger position now than we were, say, 5 years ago?
I don't think it was completely worthless. A bigger LLM, other things being equal, is more useful than a smaller LLM, even if you put it in the context of some larger system and it's just one tool among many that you use. So I don't think it was a complete waste. It's more like we should have had many flowers. We should have been cultivating many flowers, and we only cultivated the one. It's not that that flower is useless, but there's all kinds of stuff we
It's
miss.
a tulip, isn't it? Talking of flowers.
It might be a tulip, and we need some other stuff. And and we didn't study fertilizer, and we didn't learn how to weed, and we just made the tulips. And it's not a perfect metaphor here. The metaphor sort of dying on the operating table, but the point is that we stuck with this one idea to the exclusion of others. And it's not that this idea is useless, but we need a whole family of other ideas. Once we have that family, sure, we'll make some use of the LLMs within that larger context. I don't think it's a total waste of time, but the opportunity cost of doing this to the exclusion of anything else was high. And it's like in business or in investing, you're supposed to diversify your bets. And we wound up with the least intellectual diversification in AI that there has ever been, like in this 80-year history of the field, or 70, some depends how you count. We'll call it an 80-year history. I've never seen anything like this, where people basically studied one idea and excluded everything else.
Well, it's the VC model. But on the other hand, and you cite Francois Chollet on X.
Yeah.
The two things seem to be happening simultaneously. On the one hand, or three things. On the one hand, we have this product that isn't improving that dramatically. But yeah, everyone's adopting it, but it doesn't have any impact on productivity. You talk about AI, layoffs, productivity, and the Klarna effect. What's the overall consequence of this? Because it is in some ways consequential that so many people are using these products like ChatGPT.
Well, there's a few things that go into that. One is a lot of the companies that adopted it on a trial basis. And a lot of those that adopted on a trial basis were somewhat disappointed by the results, but staking a lot of hope in GPT-5. So they would sort of get the results they want with GPT-4, but there'd be a lot of mistakes and errors, hallucinations, etc. And they're like, yeah, I can't really use this yet, but I can tell this is going to be an amazing revolution. And when GPT-5 comes here, then we're going to be golden. But it didn't turn out that way. So a lot of companies now have to decide, it is what it is. We are getting some value out of it, but it was very expensive. Is it really worth it? And so we'll see, I think, less adoption. A lot of that adoption was really what they call in the field proof of concept rather than a kind of final long-term adoption. So that's one issue. Another issue, there's a great study of programming by METR, I don't know how they pronounce themselves, showing that a bunch of programmers thought it would improve productivity by 20%, and it actually cut productivity by 20% in this particular benchmark that they created. And some of what's going on is that they're very fast to write code, but then it takes a long time to fix that code. And there can be long-term consequences of the bad code, technical debt, security problems, and so forth. And I think that's probably a paradigm in other cases, too, where you think you're saving time, but then you create some mess and you've got to fix it up. And I think that's one of the reasons why productivity has been relatively limited. Yet another reason is to really use this stuff well, your data needs to be super well organized and clean and so forth. And very few companies actually have that. And so, if your data is a mess, this stuff is not magic. I think everybody liked it because they thought it was going to magically fix all the crappy data practices people had and so forth. But it doesn't really do that. And so, the tools, even in the best case, are only as good as the data. If the data aren't that good, you're not going to magically fix that. So I gave you 3 reasons. There are probably others too. There are multiple reasons why productivity has not really gone up using these tools. And, I remember having fights in early 2023 on Twitter where people were saying this is going to 10x productivity, 100x productivity. And I was saying, I don't see that. Really? You think that? It makes all these mistakes and whatever. Nobody's really even talking that way anymore. Nobody seriously thinks they're going to get 100x gain out of an LLM that I know of. I think people are realizing it just doesn't work that well. Some AI will give us 100x productivity, but it's not an AI that we know how to make yet.
Yeah, and you've been on this for a while. Back in 2020, you you wrote a Guardian piece based on GPT-3 asking.
I didn't write the Guardian piece. I wrote about the Guardian piece. That is the Guardian piece. I critiqued it somewhere and pointed out that there was an editor behind the scenes, which is hidden in what says there is the editor's note.
So finally, Gary, you wrote last year, Taming Silicon Valley, how we can ensure that AI works for us. You're a political progressive. What is this latest debacle with OpenAI and ChatGPT taught us? I had Jeffrey Hinton on the show a couple of weeks ago. I was struck by the fact that he doesn't really seem, I mean, he's politically, I think, a progressive, but he won the Nobel Prize for physics for his help in the invention of generative AI, but he doesn't seem to really know. Where are progressives here? It's one thing to criticize big tech, and you're certainly not alone in doing that, but what is this, particularly in the context of your book from last year, ensuring that AI works for us, where you were quite radical? What does this tell us about where we should go in late 2025 and on?
I don't think anything in the book changes because I foresaw all of this. I mean, I wrote in the book about the limits of these models and why they were going to get stuck. I was already, as they say, priced in. And then part of the book was warning that tech oligarchs were taking over. And I mean, that's what was probably seen then as a kind of, dark fantasy by some deranged author is basically what happened, right? I mean, the things I warned about happening have happened. The policies that I called for, I think, are still the right policies. We're further from implementing them because we have this notion that, GPT-5 is going to change the world. We have to race to get there. Only now that we've gotten there, it hasn't changed the world. I kept telling people, like, if China gets to GPT-5 first, it's not really going to change anything. They're just going to be able to write boilerplate text faster than we are. Well, that's basically what happened. Is we got there first, so we can write boilerplate text faster. That doesn't mean that we're magically now going to free Taiwan from Chinese influence because we have GPT-5 and they don't. Like, it isn't the game changer that people sort of fantasized about. And I warned about that in the book. But on the fantasy that it was going to be a game changer, the government said, don't have any restrictions on these companies at all. We don't do that in other industries. We don't tell Boeing, fuck it, don't worry about any regulation on airplanes. Just build them as fast as you can so you can beat the French companies. We don't do that, right? We still want them to be safe. But somehow we have this insane idea that we don't need to make AI safe, we just need to go fast. And going fast has accomplished nothing, and all kinds of negative consequences have already started to rear their heads. So it was not a wise
more regulation, but on the other hand, given what you're writing about now, about this massive overinvestment in this product that is hard to scale, maybe you can't make it much better. What does that tell us? I mean,
that was in the book too. I mean, part of why it was in the book is I said, don't give all of these people power on promise. You are on promise, imagining that these guys are going to do all these amazing things, and in advance of them delivering AGI, you're basically letting them run the world. Or for example, letting them have access to copyrighted materials without any compensation for the artist. You're doing that because you think that if they succeed, that they're going to do these magical things, this or that magical thing. And I said then, don't give them that power based on promise. They're not going to be able to deliver. And that was in the book too, and they didn't deliver, right? I mean, GPT-5 is not what was promised. Grok 4 is not what was promised. Llama 4 is not what was promised. Claude, whatever, is not what was promised. None of these things have actually delivered, the magic wand that they promised. But we've given them enormous power on the theory that they will make magic wands before the Chinese.
Well, in other words, Gary, what you're saying is be careful what you wish for and be careful how you use these products, because before you know it, they may be using the very data that you are interacting with these products in order to save their businesses. It's a wise warning from a wise man, Gary Marcus, who isn't Sam Altman, even if he created a photo where he began to look like him. So I was going to call you Sam. Gary, as always, a pleasure. Keep well, keep causing trouble and telling the truth. And we will
You
talk
can call
again.
me
This
Gary.
story isn't ending, is it?
You can call me Gary. You can call me Doctor. You can call me Professor. Don't call me Sam.
I won't call you Sam. Gary, not Sam Marcus. As always, Gary, pleasure. Keep well, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks a lot.